what kind of really dominates, or what really dictates the sort of imagination of the Silk Road is that you first have to have this map of Eurasia, plus maybe a little bit of Africa, and the maritime Silk Road also included the seas. So you first have to have a map of the world, basically, in order to project your understanding of this network of spaces, the network in which things and peoples moved. But this is a very spatialized understanding of the Silk Road. Whereas for me, in my own artistic research and curatorial work, and also dealing with Silk Road more in a kind of poetic and metaphysical way, I think there can be another access to it, which does not have to follow this spatialized dictation of the imagination. So if we introduce the element of time, for example, you can see how the Silk Road stands for a kind of continual transformation and mutation of different lifestyles, spheres of culture, of religious, linguistic life practices. And it's really in this kind of long-term mutation and transfiguration of the Silk Road that I am more interested in. If you think about the Mongols, or if you think about the Turkic peoples a bit before, or if you think about the Xiongnu, the Huns, even before the Turkic people, the key common feature between these nomadic tribes were that there was a very different understanding of ownership. Right, there is certainly not the need for owning land the way that agrarian cultures, the ones that we're more accustomed to, needed to occupy land and to demarcate land and to distribute land. So they were nomadic because they were nomadic pastoralists. They would move according to the season, according to the needs of the livestock that they raise. So there's, in general, a kind of modesty in their lifestyle, because you don't need to accumulate something that is of a surplus kind of value, because you cannot quite make use of the surplus. So there were quite interesting studies on why, for example, even when scientific or technological advancements were there, they actually didn't need to make use of it. So, for example, in the Arab Peninsula, camels were used consistently until the modern era, even though people have had invented wheels already like 2 or 3 millennium ago. So there was simply not that need to kind of speed up or to scale up the caravan. So people thought camel was just as good, and they stayed with the camel for all this time. So that aspect of a moderation in life is quite important, and is of course very different from the sedentary cultures. Although I do have to say that this aspect of the surplus did exist. It's not like it was completely a self-sustained system. It had also, of course, with the outside, and the way they did interact, the nomadic tribes. They interact with the outside was through trade. So there they actually needed to accrue some kind of surplus, which could be livestock, which could be furs and things like that. So that's kind of the very dry historical or anthropological take on the nomadic peoples. But if we kind of take it a little bit into a more speculative or more philosophical realm, I think we can derive different cultural techniques from the nomadic cultures. So from this lack of ownership, we can maybe claim a kind of custodianship to the ecological system, right? So you're not looking at how do I own land or not own land, how do I own or not own livestock, but I exist interdependence with all of these entities. And that includes the livestock, but it can also include the forests, the pastures, the rivers, the animals in the rivers. And it can go into even micro kind of scale and look at minerals and fluids and all of this. So in a way, I'm quite my own kind of approach to the Silk Road and the nomadic as a philosophy maybe is not so much just looking at the anthropological studies on that, but to kind of expand it into this realm where you can speculate what could that mean? What could this custodianship mean for us today? Right? Can we derive different kind of legal code based not on individuals and not on personhood and not on discrete entities, but based on a sort of interrelational matrix or network? Anybody studying nomadic people or nomadology as a philosophy cannot do without mentioning, of course, Deleuze and Guattari, who wrote one chapter of their very famous A Thousand Plateaus is called Nomadology, and where there are a few, I think, really important points that quite correspond with my own experience with traveling and studying Central Asia. So in their version, this nomadic society is pitted against the sedentary society in that in the sedentary society, we distribute land, whereas for the nomads, they're distributed by space. And another way of understanding that is in our culture, we first set the points, and then we try to connect the points by lines, right? So if you think about how we construct villages and cities, we first have the points and then we have the lines. But for the nomads, they didn't have it's not points first, but it was the lines first. So for them, mobility, as in something that happens as these lines, is something that takes a primary importance, and then only the points that temporarily kind of emerge on those lines. And that can lead us to maybe the other part of the question, which is how do we understand BRI and contemporary infrastructure projects? Because using this scheme of the points and lines, you can see very well how these infrastructure projects are built on a sort of very generic understanding of space, where we have the points because we have the points being the ports, the nodal points in the oil or gas pipeline. And then you try to find ways to connect them, right? And you try to find ways to connect them that is economically sensible or geopolitically favorable to your condition. And yeah, so BRI in general as an organizing mechanism of global supply chain or a reorganizing mechanism of global supply chain of raw materials, of processing capacities, of productivity. All of this is driving towards a kind of maximization of productivity. And that follows, I think, a very specific imagination of what infrastructure can mean or what production can mean, as opposed to what we spoke about earlier with this kind of moderation and disinterest in surplus. Capitalism is and has always been an embodiment of networked forms of organization, right? So if you think about Friedrich Hayek's invisible hand, how the supply and demand can be balanced in a market by this invisible hand, how this kind of decentralized forms of knowledge can be somehow mediated by this mechanism, that's already a decentralized form of a networked form of organization. So I guess one thing that we should be clear is that networks themselves are neutral, or themselves are not necessarily good or bad. So just having a centralized network doesn't mean that it's just it's bad because it's a tyranny of centralized power. And just having a decentralized network doesn't mean that you're on the moral high ground, because as you see, decentralized forms of organization has been with capitalism for a long time, and it really depends on us to program it and to insert it with social and cultural meanings. So again, with the decentralized network, for example, you also had the Chilean, the Soviet, and cybernetic projects that aimed to stimulate the economy, but for a very different kind of society, right? Which both failed for various reasons. But nevertheless, you can see how competing kind of ideological foundations can take the same basically form of network. So we're now living in a time of a sort of in between time, or time where we oscillate in between decentralization and re-centralization of networks, where what used to be, when internet was invented, a very kind of flat space of commons, of freedom, is now increasingly re-centralized around big tech companies. And also with the free trade of capitalism, of late capitalism, we see strangely a re-emergence of borders and of tariff wars, of trade wars. So all of these protectionist mechanisms, they're actually not new, because we've had them as recent as before the end of the World War, when the US had a tariff at something like 40-something%. And before that, we had it with Germany and Japan. And before that, we even had it with the UK. So protectionism is not new, but that is increasingly kind of creating choke points in this sort of decentralized network of capitalism today. First, we have to understand where we are, right, and not be naive about any form of particular form of networks, but then to understand the sort of coexistence and the mutations of all these networks around us, and then we can try to insert ourselves somewhere and see if resistance is possible. So, of course, you have anti-globalist movements, which is basically going off grid from this network. So you have community forms of local economy, local organizations that really try to detach and dislodge itself from global trade. I'm not kind of taking a simple stance between this anti-globalist movement and globalization, because I did grow up actually in a time when China slowly opened itself up to globalization. I think if you grow up, really, if you remember that, you had the most ugliest toys when you were young, and you didn't have M&Ms, you didn't have anything when you were young, you don't take an easy stance against globalization. But I think the interesting kind of maybe the interesting possibilities or openings here are, when you see that maybe globalization kind of runs out of steam, and then sometimes by necessity you have to go back or scale down to a certain older network. So for example, I was speaking with a Filipino colleague recently who told me that the Philippines, I think, is embracing 5G technology, and they're on way to signing some contracts with Huawei from China. I think there are certain difficulties. And then for the most current challenges in front of the government, they actually decided, okay, we won't be able to make it to 5G right now, so let's go back to radio. So for certain activities that they want, I think it has to do with the pandemic, they needed to somehow get everybody tracked or something. So they actually went back to radio. which is an extremely old form of network. And so these kind of moments I find quite interesting to think with, because we don't necessarily have to follow this sort of teleological development in terms of technology, but we can allow and we can encourage all these different forms of networks to coexist. Primarily, there are a few there are a few Chinese scholars. Zhao Tingyang being probably one of the better known proponents, because his book on tianxia as the Chinese world order has been translated into many foreign languages. The tricky thing is, of course, when you conflate or you try to make a case for today's China or today's world system that China pursues with all this historical what tianxia meant historically. So it gets tricky when you make a case for today's China with the case of historical China, right? Almost as if you're saying, because tianxia was a functional system which managed to keep regional peace, which managed to allow different polities to enter in interaction with China and for everybody to prosper, just because this had happened in history, whatever we do today under the name of tianxia would achieve the same. Zhao Tingyang and a few other scholars, they argue for tianxia as this ideal form of global governance, taking inspiration from tianxia, the historical tianxia. And this global governance is beyond the sort of narrow understanding of international politics. And it has a much larger goal, which is to pursue the harmony and common well-being of all peoples. You realize a lot of this language is very vague, and it's exactly the same vague language that they used in the historical model of tianxia. But at the same time, you realize that there are conceptual slippages. There are actually a lot of pitfalls in this system, because, as we said earlier, tianxia was not an equal system, right? It's not based. You do not perceive every other country and polity in light of equal sovereignty. But the world system that we have today is constructed on this. It took so much pains to arrive here. And then, of course, you have this moments where I think at some kind of ASEAN meeting or some international meeting where China wanted to convene a summit with a few smaller Asian countries, and the diplomats acted in quite an arrogant way, basically calling those countries as small countries. And then those countries were so pissed they basically didn't show up at the meeting. You see that it's just not the same arena anymore, and you cannot follow the same playbook as you had 500 years ago, when you had a world system that was actually not built on equal sovereignty. I think many critics have focused on, with the BRI, with all this financing of infrastructures, of oil and gas pipelines, ports, airports, the financing of that has happened through mostly Chinese money, sometimes with the Chinese backed Asian investment infrastructure investment bank and other Chinese entities. So many critics have focused on how some of this financing presented the acute risk of being a debt trap, so that if the countries are unable to meet the repayment deadline, and when the debt defaults, they have to be forced to concede certain assets to China. And that was the case when it happened a few years back with the port in Sri Lanka, where the Sri Lankan government was unable to pay back the debt, and therefore they basically swapped their very strategic port. They swapped a 99-year usership, a lease of that port, with the debt, to write off the debt to China. Problem is, this is one of the few cases where defaulted debt actually led to a sort of neo-colonial kind of concession. And I think in this case, really, the importance is rather in the military strategic importance of the port than the debt itself. Because if you look at other cases, most notably in Africa, there has been various studies to show that in most cases where debt defaulted, they were able to renegotiate the debt conditions with China, and most of the cases resolved in favorable conditions to the lending countries, so that this debt trap is actually less a problem. But once again, I think the deeper layer is when China got that port in Sri Lanka overlooking the Indian Ocean, that's really a more possibly military agenda-driven move. So colonialism, it's almost contradictory, because when everybody knows that this Chinese BRI is financially not, it just simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't make business sense for China. But China is still engaging in all of this overseas financing. And the only reason for explaining that is that this is a kind of a buying of legitimacy. As we tried to explain earlier, there has to be new rules, ideas, and institutions that represent Chinese ideas of global governance. And that, with all this financial, completely illogical and not sensible financial arrangements, these are tools to actually buy its way into this. That's the question that I think we feel a bit more ambivalent about, because we do know, growing up, we do know globalization brought to us. There are many critics who are categorically critical about this form of globalization that happened at such speed and at such scale that it almost it changes things overnight, so that the spillover effect to the local population is not even studied. So examples given are like, when you build a highway across some really rural areas where there used to be only dirt road, all these populations in between, they don't necessarily benefit from it, because the highway actually doesn't bring traffic to the local village, right? Whereas when you had the dirt road, you had a very slow movement of goods and of people, and people needed to stop over and consume things. So there are all these local transactions that actually kept the livelihood for the locals. So things like that, I see them being a sort of acute circumstances, but at the same time, there's also tangible benefits with globalization. I don't want to take a simple stance here, but what I could say is, once again, this sort of coexistence of different levels of economic activities, different levels of interactions, and also very creative ways of engaging with globalization at different levels. That could be an interesting scope for especially people like us who were not in this for policy or for international relations. We're in this to understand what kind of people to people, what kind of low-end globalization can mean, right? So you can maybe observe, for example, how with the smartphone, there's a sort of there's the globalized market with Apple and Samsung, but then in Africa, you have various kind of low-end, no-name kind of brands of smartphones, but they're equally valid, and they help people in carrying out daily activities, and they also allow people to to creatively kind of engage with technology, and they become, important community, almost community making kind of tools. Like people would aggregate, people would make parties, and for that they need music, and for that they need a smartphone, and for that they would maybe hack a certain speaker system. So they will bring creativities, and they would use technology in a way that maybe in the West or in higher income societies people don't do in the same way. So these kind of it does happen with globalization, but it's a very kind of particular form of globalization that usually ewates the common narrative of globalization. I think that can actually happen, not necessarily with BRI, but that is actually happening a lot right now, and that's where maybe we can focus our attention on.